The Freedom Convoy grabbed our attention all across North America, I should say, when truckers protested Canada's government and their COVID vaccine mandates. Many joined in that movement, including a pastor who shared the message of freedom with those trucker protesters, and he ended up in trouble with the law for doing so. He now faces 10 years in prison for delivering a sermon to those truckers. Now his son, pleading his case and his dad's case about Canada's draconian policies. He delivered a speech in Europe. Many in attendance gave him a standing ovation. Here's a portion of those remarks in front of the EU Parliament.
I would like to stand here and tell you all the things about freedom and democracy that I like, but I no longer know those things. They have been taken away from us Canadians. Canada has fallen. We no longer have freedom of religion or freedom of speech, or the right to protest or assemble or associate or express ourselves or have free media or disagree with the government. Anyone who does so is arrested, charged, and jailed as political dissidents.
I mean, it is a pretty astounding thing to watch what's happening north of the border. And I like Canadians, they're friendly, and I like hockey, and poutine is delicious and all of that. But if you look at their culture, and especially their lack of culture around free speech, free expression, freedom of religion, it's quite illiberal in what is seen as a free country. In their national anthem, they call themselves the true North, strong and free. But their laws don't reflect that in some pretty disturbing ways.
And people are laying at the feet of Trudeau, who himself has sometimes been a study in contrast about his personal freedoms versus your personal freedoms as a Canadian. I just want to give a shout out to this young man. What is he, 23 years old? Yeah. I mean, the poise and the substance with which he delivered this across the pond to the EU in Brussels is pretty remarkable. And the applause he got there, Guy, really tells us something about our neighbors in the West and how they're looking at the erosion of freedoms in this country and to the north of us in Canada. The other thing I wanted to mention here is when you look at this guy who was against the COVID mandate, gave the sermon to the truckers, and then you contrast that to our earlier crime segment that you also led us on in the show. Guy, people don't know who's a criminal, who's not, what's a crime, what's not anymore. We don't have these standards and structures and objective criterion that we can follow as freedom-loving citizens of America or Canada and say, that's a crime, you're going to get in trouble for it. That's not a crime, that's a criminal, that's not a criminal. This guy is under house arrest for what happened.
And we've seen
other people go free.
There have been other examples of hate speech in Canada, getting people thrown in prison. And I look at stories like this and I say, thank God we have our First Amendment. We still have it in this country, Tommy. You interviewed this actual pastor, who on your show for Outkick. Let's watch that clip together.
I grew up behind the Iron Curtain. I've seen this movie before. Ultimately, I was arrested 5 times. I spent the first time 3 days on concrete, later 50 days in solitary confinement, metal cages, psych ward, believe it or not. And then eventually they took me to a mag spot for the most dangerous terrorists in a country. You know, you look at this and the only thing that comes to mind, Soviet Russia.
I mean, sometimes our rhetoric gets a little overheated, but what he just described sounded like the Gulag.
Yeah, when you think about it, this is Canada. We're not far from Canada right now, and this is astonishing. And I think people are also too quick to give leaders around the world, including here in the United States, COVID amnesty for what they did and the freedoms that they took away and infringed upon. And in Canada, it was so much worse than here, but it was still bad here. But these freedom truckers, when this happened, I was so proud of them because they stood up. They said, we're not going to take this. And this pastor, as you heard when he was on my show, he said time and time again, they tried to get him. And time again, he stood up anyway. And this reminds me of our founding fathers. You know, it was live free or die. There was no other option. And the fact that there's still an embodiment of that here today and being in Canada, when I interviewed this man, he was on house arrest. He was Zooming with me with being on house arrest. When you think about that, very few people are actually willing to stand up for freedom anymore. He did, and he always will, and that's inspiring to me.
Joe, there's also just the substance here of vaccine mandates.
Yeah.
Imposing this on truckers who are sitting by themselves all day long and literally keeping society functioning at all times, but especially during COVID. To do that to them the way that they did it with that jackboot of government was astounding.
probably the most isolated job you could have in the world is being a trucker, right? And you see Justin Trudeau, he's dipping now into the 30s as far as his approval. So maybe Canada is catching on. I'll leave it here real